$20 for the fat one. The cruel laughter echoed through the dusty Colorado courthouse as Judge Horus Bradock pointed his gavel at Abigail Yoder, a woman whose only crime was being Amish alone and abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. But when grieving rancher Lucas Boone stepped forward with quiet dignity and said those 4 words that silenced an entire town, "I'll take the Amish girl," he didn't just claim a wife. He ignited a war with the most powerful men in San Miguel County. Before you judge this story, watch until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this tale of courage has traveled. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the San Miguel County courthouse steps, where a crowd had gathered like vultures around carrion. The year was 1882, and the small Colorado mining town had seen its share of cruelty, but nothing quite like this. Judge Horus Bradock, a man whose corpulent frame matched his outsized ego, stood behind a makeshift podium, his black robes billowing in the hot wind like the wings of some predatory bird. "Gentlemen," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the town square with practiced authority. "Today we solve 2 problems at once: the burden of indigent women on our county's resources and the need for hard-working wives among our bachelor population." The crowd cheered, a mix of miners still covered in rock dust, ranchers with sun-weathered faces, and townspeople eager for entertainment on what would otherwise be another monotonous Thursday. They pressed closer to the courthouse steps where 5 women stood in a line, their faces masks of humiliation and fear. Among them stood Abigail Yoder, and she was impossible to miss. Not because she was beautiful in the conventional sense the crowd had made their opinions on that matter abundantly clear. She was a large woman, her frame solid and strong from years of farm work, dressed in the plain gray dress and white prayer cap of her Amish faith. At 28, she had the kind of presence that should have commanded respect, but in this crowd it only drew mockery. "Look at the size of that one," someone shouted from the back. "She'd eat a man out of house and home. Better get 2 marriage licenses, 1 for each half," another voice called out, followed by raucous laughter. Abigail kept her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. She recited silent prayers in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language of her childhood, trying to drown out the cruelty with words of faith. But even scripture couldn't entirely shield her from the shame of this moment. She had never imagined her life would lead here. Just 6 months ago, she had been living with her family in the Amish settlement near Alamosa, 200 miles to the south. But when her father died of pneumonia last winter, leaving behind debts to English merchants he'd hidden from the community, everything had unraveled. The elders had discovered that her father had been buying supplies on credit, violating the Ordnung, their sacred rules of living. The shame had been too great. Her mother, already weak from years of bearing children and working the unforgiving land, had died of grief within weeks. Abigail and her younger sister Martha had been left alone, and the community that should have embraced them in their time of need had instead turned cold. The bishop had called it God's judgment on their father's pride. When the English creditors came calling, threatening to seize the farm that had been promised to another family, the elders made their decision. The sisters were put under the ban, shunned, completely cast out as if they had never existed. Martha, pretty and only 19, had quickly found work as a domestic servant for a wealthy family in Denver. But Abigail, with her plain face and substantial figure, had found every door closed to her. She'd traveled from town to town seeking work, growing more desperate with each rejection. When she'd finally reached San Miguel County, she'd had exactly 3 cents to her name and hadn't eaten in 2 days. The county sheriff had found her collapsed behind the general store, weak from hunger. Instead of helping her, he'd arrested her for vagrancy. That's how she'd ended up here in what Judge Bradock called his innovative solution to the vagrant problem. "Now, gentlemen," the judge continued, clearly enjoying his role as auctioneer of human misery, "let's start with our first offering. Mrs. Patricia Hollis, widow, age 32, experienced in cooking and household management. She comes with a clean bill of health from Doc Morrison, who'll start the bidding at $10. Patricia Hollis was a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and hollow cheeks that spoke of too many hungry nights. Her husband had died in a mine collapse 6 months prior, leaving her with nothing but debt. She stood with her chin raised, trying to maintain some dignity as men bid on her like livestock. $15, called out Jake Murdoch, a miner known for his rough handling of both ore and women. 20 bummers countered Samuel Price, who owned a small ranch north of town. The bidding continued, and Patricia was finally claimed for $35 by Price, who at least had a reputation for being decent, if dull. She walked down the steps with measured grace, taking the arm he offered with a resignation that broke Abigail's heart. The next 3 women went similarly. A young Mexican woman named Rosa, who spoke little English, claimed by a shopkeeper for $28. A widow named Catherine Burke, with 2 children who were not part of the bargain, having been sent to the county orphanage purchased by a lonely farmer for $40, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 18, bought by a group of miners who pooled their money, their intentions clear in their leering grins. Then came Abigail's turn. "And now," Judge Bradock announced with particular relish, "we have something special. Miss Abigail Yoder, age 28, of the Amish persuasion. She's strong as an ox, just look at her. Perfect for heavy farm work, knows how to cook clean, make cheese and butter. Tend gardens, preserve food for winter. A real bargain for the right man." The crowd's laughter grew crueler. "You'd need a fortune just to feed her," someone shouted. "My horse would collapse trying to carry her home." 10 cents, a drunk miner yelled out mockingly. "That's all I got for livestock that size?" The laughter reached a crescendo, and Abigail felt tears burning behind her eyes. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. She thought of Christ on the cross, mocked by Roman soldiers, and tried to find strength in his suffering. Judge Bradock's face grew red with irritation. This was supposed to be a profitable venture. He got a cut of every transaction, and the Amish woman was turning into an embarrassment. "Come now, gentlemen. Surely someone needs a hard-working wife. Let's start the bidding at $5. A mere $5 for a woman who knows the value of honest work." Silence. $3 then. More laughter, but no bids. $1. Surely she's worth a single dollar. It was then that a voice cut through the mockery like a blade through butter. "I'll take the Amish girl." The crowd turned almost as one to see who had spoken. Standing at the back, having just arrived on horseback, was Lucas Boone. The laughter died instantly, replaced by shocked whispers. Lucas Boone was something of a legend in San Miguel County, though not for the reasons most men achieved notoriety in these parts. He wasn't the richest rancher, nor the fastest gun, nor the best card player. He was known for something far rarer in this rough country: unshakable integrity. At 35, he cut an impressive figure, tall and lean from years of hard work, with dark hair just beginning to show threads of silver at the temples and eyes the color of winter sky. His face was weathered but handsome in a quiet way, marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. He wore simple rancher's clothes, worn leather boots, canvas pants, a blue work shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. No fancy gun belt, no silver spurs, nothing to mark him as anything other than what he was: a hard-working man who minded his own business. But everyone knew his story, and it had earned him a respect that money couldn't buy. Lucas had come to Colorado 8 years ago with his wife Mary and their young son Thomas. They'd claimed a piece of land in the valley, fighting against drought, cold, and the constant threat of losing everything. But Lucas had persevered slowly, building up a small but respectable cattle operation. He'd been one of the few ranchers to deal fairly with the Apache bands that moved through the territory, earning their trust through honest trade rather than bullets. Then 3 years ago, tragedy struck. Scarlet fever swept through the county like wildfire. It took Thomas, first only 7 years old, buried on a hill overlooking the valley he'd loved to explore. Mary had never recovered from the loss. She'd lingered for 6 months, growing thinner and more transparent, like she was already halfway to joining their son. When she finally passed, some said it was mercy. Lucas had buried her next to Thomas and thrown himself into work with a single-minded determination that worried his few friends. He'd dismissed his ranch hands, preferring to work alone. He came to town only when absolutely necessary, conducting his business with quiet efficiency before disappearing back to his ranch. Some said he'd gone half-mad with grief. Others said he was the sanest man in the county, having learned what truly mattered in life. Now here he stood, his presence commanding attention without effort. "Mr. Boone," Judge Bradock said, clearly flustered. "Surely you're joking. A man of your standing." "I said, I'll take her." Lucas repeated, his voice calm but carrying an edge that suggested he wouldn't repeat himself a third time. He walked forward through the crowd, which parted before him like water. What's the price? Well, that is, we hadn't actually set $20, Lucas said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small leather pouch. That seems to be the going rate. He climbed the steps with deliberate slowness, his boots making solid thuds against the wood. When he reached the top, he didn't look at Judge Bradock or the crowd. He looked directly at Abigail, and for the first time since this nightmare began, someone was looking at her like she was a human being. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "my name is Lucas Boone. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here. I need someone who knows how to run a household and isn't afraid of hard work. The place has been neglected since my wife passed. I can offer you a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, and fair treatment. I'm not an easy man to live with. I keep to myself mostly, but I give you my word, you'll be safe and respected under my roof." Abigail looked up at him, stunned. His eyes were kind but tired, carrying a weight of sorrow that she recognized in her own reflection. He wasn't looking at her with desire or mockery or even pity. He was looking at her like someone offering a business arrangement with dignity and tact on both sides. I accept," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wait just a minute," Judge Bradock interrupted, his face flushed with anger. "Boone, you can't be serious. This woman is Careful, Judge," Lucas said, turning to face him with a look that could have frozen fire. "Choose your next words very carefully. This woman is about to be my wife, and I don't take kindly to anyone disrespecting my family." The threat was implicit but clear. Lucas Boone might be a peaceful man, but everyone knew he'd fought in the war between the states, had been at Antietam and Gettysburg. He knew how to handle violence when it came calling. Judge Bradock swallowed whatever he'd been about to say. He grabbed the $20 Lucas offered with poor grace. "Fine. She's yours. May you get what you deserve from this arrangement." Lucas ignored him, turning back to Abigail and offering his arm. "Mrs. Yoder, shall we go?" She took his arm, her hand trembling slightly, and he led her down the steps. The crowd remained silent, shocked by the turn of events. As they passed through, Abigail heard whispers starting up again, but they were different now, confused, speculative, some even respectful. Lucas helped her up onto his wagon, which was loaded with supplies from town. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Mr. Boone," she said quietly, as they started to move, "why did you—" "We'll have plenty of time to talk on the ride to the ranch," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But if you're wondering if I expect, that is what I said was true. I need help with the household. Nothing more. You'll have your own room." Relief flooded through her so powerfully she almost wept. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said with a bitter smile. "You haven't seen the state of the place. And there's something else you should know right away. My nephew Henry lives with me. He's 12 and he's had a hard time of it. His mother was my sister, died 2 years ago. His father was Apache." Abigail absorbed this information. A half-Apache boy would face terrible prejudice in most households. "Does he know about this arrangement?" "Not yet, but Henry's a good boy, smart, hard-working when he wants to be. He just needs—" Lucas paused, searching for words. "He needs what I can't give him. Maybe what neither of us can give him alone but together." He didn't finish the thought, but Abigail understood. They were 3 broken people cast off by society for different reasons, trying to make something whole from the pieces. As they rode out of town, Abigail caught sight of Judge Bradock standing on the courthouse steps, watching them leave with an expression of dark satisfaction that sent a chill down her spine despite the warm afternoon sun. She had the feeling this wasn't over, that the judge had plans within plans, and Lucas Boone had just made himself an enemy. The road to the ranch wound through increasingly rough country, following a creek that sparkled in the afternoon light. Lucas pointed out landmarks as they went Eagle Rock, where golden eagles nested every spring, the grove of cottonwoods where his son used to play, the field where he'd lost 30 head of cattle to wolves the first winter. "It's beautiful country," Abigail said, and meant it. After the flat farmlands of her youth, the dramatic Colorado landscape took her breath away. "Beautiful and harsh," Lucas agreed. "It doesn't forgive mistakes. But if you respect it, work with it instead of against it, it provides." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Abigail found herself stealing glances at this unusual man who'd saved her from humiliation. His profile was strong, his hands steady on the reins. There was a gentleness in how he handled the horses that spoke well of his character. "You're probably wondering about me," she said eventually. "Why an Amish woman would be so far from her people." "Your business is your own," Lucas said. "If you want to tell me, I'll listen. If not, that's fine too. We all have our ghosts." The kindness of that simple statement nearly undid her. She found herself telling him everything: her father's debts, her mother's death, the shunning, the desperate journey that had led her to that courthouse. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. "I'm sorry for your losses," he said when she finished. "Seems we've both learned that faith communities can fail us when we need them most. You've had troubles with the church." His jaw tightened. "After Mary and Thomas died, the minister said it was God's will. Said I should rejoice that they were in a better place. I told him that if God wanted my wife and boy so badly, he could have asked me first. Haven't been back since." They were approaching the ranch now, and Abigail could see why he'd warned her. The main house was solidly built of logs and stone, but it showed clear signs of neglect. The garden was overgrown with weeds. One shutter hung at an angle, and the porch was covered in dust and debris. But she also saw the potential, the good bones of the house, the well-positioned barn, the fences that needed mending but were fundamentally sound. And beyond it all, the magnificent valley stretching out with mountains rising in the distance like promises of permanence. "It needs work," Lucas said unnecessarily, a note of embarrassment in his voice. "Every home needs work," Abigail replied. "That's what makes it a home, the caring for it." He looked at her with surprise and something that might have been hope. That's what Mary used to say." Before Abigail could respond, a figure emerged from the barn, a boy tall for his age with the kind of coloring that immediately marked him as mixed heritage. His skin was copper-toned, his hair black as coal, but with a hint of wave that spoke of his white ancestry. His eyes, when he got close enough for Abigail to see, were a striking green Lucas's eyes in a face that otherwise favored his Apache father. "Uncle Luke," the boy said, eyeing Abigail warily. "Who's this?" "Henry, this is Miss Abigail Yoder. She's going to be staying with us, helping with the house and things." "Miss Yoder, this is my nephew, Henry Boone." The boy's expression grew even more suspicious. "Helping with things." Lucas climbed down from the wagon and helped Abigail down as well. "We were married in town today," he said simply. "Legal and proper. Miss Yoder, Mrs. Boone now needed a home. We need help. It's a practical arrangement." Henry's green eyes widened, then narrowed. "You replaced Aunt Mary. No one could replace your aunt," Lucas said firmly. "This is different. Mrs. Boone and I have an understanding. She'll help us make this place a proper home again. In return, we give her safety and respect. That's all." The boy looked between them, clearly trying to process this information. Finally, he addressed Abigail directly. "Can you cook? Uncle Luke burns everything, even coffee." Despite the tension, Abigail found herself smiling. "I can cook, including coffee that doesn't taste like charcoal. And you won't try to send me away to school. Plus, the last housekeeper Uncle Luke hired said I needed civilizing at the Indian school." Abigail's heart ached at the fear hiding behind the boy's defiant tone. "I don't believe in taking children from their families," she said firmly. "You belong here with your uncle." Henry studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then, I'll show you the house. Uncle Luke probably didn't mention that the stove has a temperamental damper and the pump in the kitchen needs to be primed just right, or it won't work." As the boy led her toward the house, chattering about its various quirks and challenges, Abigail caught Lucas watching them with an expression of cautious hope. She understood that feeling. They were all walking wounded here, trying to build something from broken pieces. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Dust covered every surface, dishes were piled in the dry sink, and the main room smelled of neglect and old smoke. But the structure was sound good. Wooden floors, a large stone fireplace. Windows that would let in plenty of light once cleaned. "I know it's bad," Henry said, suddenly self-conscious. "Uncle Luke and I, we try, but you're ranchers, not housekeepers," Abigail finished gently. "There's no shame in that. Everyone has their strengths. Now why don't you show me where things are and we'll see about getting some supper started." As she rolled up her sleeves and began heating water for cleaning, Abigail felt something she hadn't experienced in months: purpose. This wasn't the life she'd planned, married to an Amish farmer, raising children in the faith of her fathers. But perhaps it was the life God had intended for her all along. Outside, she could hear Lucas and Henry working, their voices carrying on the evening air. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. She began to hum as she worked an old hymn from her childhood. The words came back to her in Pennsylvania Dutch, then English. "Though the way be dark and dreary, and our feet be worn and weary, yet we'll follow, follow on." Henry appeared in the doorway. "That's pretty. What language was that first part?" "Pennsylvania Dutch. It's what my people speak." "I speak some Apache," he offered shyly. "My mother taught me before she died. Uncle Luke says it's good to remember where we come from." "Your uncle is a wise man." Henry grinned, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Don't let him hear you say that. He already thinks he knows everything about ranching." As if summoned by his name, Lucas appeared behind his nephew. "I heard that boy, and I do know everything about ranching. It's everything else I'm not so good at." He looked around the kitchen where Abigail had already made visible progress. The dishes were soaking, the stove was heating, and the smell of fresh coffee properly made was beginning to fill the air. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's what I'm here for," Abigail replied, but she meant more than just the cleaning, as the three of them sat down to a simple supper of beans and cornbread. All she could manage with the supplies on hand, Abigail noticed something. They didn't quite fit together yet, these three disparate souls brought together by circumstance and necessity. But there was potential here, like a garden waiting for someone to clear the weeds and let the good plants grow. After supper, Lucas showed her to her room, small but clean, with a bed dresser and washstand. It had clearly been closed up for some time. "This was Mary's sewing room," he said quietly. "I hope that's not—" "I can clear out the barn loft if you'd prefer." "It's perfect," Abigail interrupted. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Lucas," he corrected. "We're married now, even if it's just a legal arrangement. Might as well use first names." After he left, Abigail sat on the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day. This morning, she'd stood on those courthouse steps believing her life was over. Tonight, she had a home, a purpose, and two people who needed her as much as she needed them. She knelt beside the bed and prayed, not in the formal way she'd been taught, but from her heart. "Lord, I don't understand your ways. I don't know why you led me through such darkness to get here. But I thank you for Lucas Boone's kindness, for Henry's acceptance, for this chance to be useful again. Help me to serve them well. Help us to heal each other. And if there's danger coming, and I fear there is, give us the strength to face it together." Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch cattle lowing in the distance, horses shifting in the barn, the creek gurgling over stones. It was nothing like the ordered farmland of her youth, but it felt right somehow. As she prepared for bed, Abigail thought about Judge Bradock's expression as they'd left town. There was something calculating in it, something that suggested this story was far from over. She'd overheard enough in her weeks of desperate wandering to know that powerful men in this territory had plans within plans, and that the railroad companies were always looking for water rights and land to claim. Lucas's ranch, with its creek access and good grazing land, would be valuable to the right people. And Lucas himself, with his reputation for integrity, might be seen as an obstacle to those plans. By claiming her today, by showing public defiance to the judge's mockery, he might have painted a target on all their backs. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight she had a roof over her head and a purpose for her hands. Tonight she wasn't Abigail Yoder, the shunned Amish woman too large and plain for anyone to want. She was Abigail Boone, with a home to tend and people to care for. The moon rose full and bright over the Colorado mountains, bathing the ranch in silver light. In the main house, Lucas sat by the dying fire, wondering what had possessed him to claim a stranger as his wife. In his room, Henry pressed his ear to the wall, listening to the unfamiliar sound of a woman humming hymns as she prepared for bed. And in her small room, Abigail folded her worn dress carefully and laid out her plans for tomorrow: bread to bake floors, to scrub a garden, to resurrect. None of them knew that in town Judge Braddock was meeting with Clayton Reeves, the railroad company's chief legal representative. They were discussing water rights, grazing permits, and how to deal with obstacles to progress. Lucas Boone's name featured prominently in their conversation, as did speculation about his new wife and what her presence might mean for their plans. "He's gotten too comfortable," Braddock was saying, pouring another whiskey. "Thinks his reputation protects him, but every man has a weakness. Now we know that misguided sense of charity. He's taken in an outcast woman and a half-breed boy. That tells us everything we need to know about where to apply pressure." Reeves smiled an expression that never reached his eyes. "The railroad needs that water access. One way or another, we'll get it. If Boone wants to play the hero, he'll learn what that costs in the real world." But back at the ranch, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon, three wounded souls were beginning the slow process of becoming something more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming a family, though none of them would have used that word yet. The night deepened, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Coyotes sang in the distant hills, their voices wild and free. And in a small ranch house in Colorado, three people slept under the same roof, each carrying their own grief, but no longer carrying it alone. This was how it began, not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with simple kindness, shared work, and the gradual recognition that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. It would be tested, this fragile new thing they were building. The world would try to tear it apart. But tonight, it was enough that they were safe-fed and no longer alone. The first day was ending, and with it the first chapter of a story that would become legend in San Miguel County, the story of how a grieving rancher, a shunned Amish woman, and a half-Apache boy stood against the powerful and proved that sometimes the meek really do inherit the earth. But that was all to come. Tonight there was just the peace of a sleeping household, the promise of tomorrow's work, and the first fragile shoots of hope growing in ground that had seemed too hard and dry for anything to flourish. The rooster's crow came too early, as it always did, but Abigail was already awake, her internal clock still set to farm hours despite months of wandering. She dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers finding the familiar pins and ties of her plain dress without need for light. Through the thin walls, she could hear Lucas already moving about the careful tread of a man trying not to wake others. She found him in the kitchen, struggling with the temperamental stove that Henry had warned her about. He looked up when she entered, a rueful smile crossing his weathered face. "I was trying to get it started for you," he said, stepping back from the smoking mess he'd created. "Appears I've made things worse." "The damper needs to be set, just so," Abigail said, moving past him to adjust the mechanism with practiced ease. Their bodies came close in the small space, and she caught the scent of him, leather wood smoke, and something clean like mountain air. He stepped back quickly, as if burned, and she pretended not to notice his discomfort. "There. It should draw properly now." Within minutes, she had the fire burning steadily and coffee brewing. Lucas watched from the doorway, seeming unsure whether to stay or go. "I usually just grab some jerky and hardtack," he admitted. "Haven't had a proper breakfast in, well, a long time." "Then it's past time you did," Abigail said firmly, already mixing batter for flapjacks. "A man can't work properly on an empty stomach, and growing boys certainly can't." As if summoned by the mention of food, Henry appeared, his black hair sticking up at odd angles. Do I smell actual breakfast?" "You do indeed," Abigail confirmed, flipping the first batch of flapjacks with satisfying precision. "Now, both of you sit. And Henry, there's a pitcher of water and a basin on the porch. Hands and face first, if you please." The boy grumbled but complied, and Lucas followed suit without being asked, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When they returned, Abigail had set the table with what mismatched plates and cups she could find, laden with golden flapjacks, fried eggs, and thick slices of bacon. This is wonderful," Lucas said after his first bite, and the genuine appreciation in his voice warmed something in Abigail's chest. Henry was less restrained, attacking his plate with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd been living on his uncle's cooking for too long. "Can we have this every day?" he asked through a mouthful of flapjack. "Don't talk with your mouth full," Abigail corrected gently. "And yes, a proper breakfast is important, though it won't always be quite this elaborate." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of forks on plates and the crackling of the fire. Then Lucas cleared his throat. I need to tell you both something. What happened yesterday in town? It's going to have consequences. Henry's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What kind of consequences? Judge Bradock isn't a man who likes being shown up, and by claiming Abigail Mrs. Boone the way I did, I essentially thumbed my nose at him in front of the whole town. Lucas pushed his eggs around his plate, choosing his words carefully. The judge has connections with the railroad company. They've been eyeing our water rights for months. But the creek runs through our land, Henry protested. We have the deed. Having the deed and keeping the land can be two different things when powerful men want what you have, Lucas said grimly. I want you both to be careful. Stay close to the house unless I'm with you, and if anyone comes calling, especially anyone official-looking, you come get me immediately. Abigail felt a chill despite the warm kitchen.
You think they'll try to force you out? I think Judge Bradock is a snake who's been waiting for an opportunity to strike. By marrying you, I might have given him one. Lucas met her eyes steadily. I want you to know if you're having second thoughts about this arrangement. I'm not, Abigail said firmly, surprising herself with her vehemence. You saved me from humiliation and worse yesterday. If there's trouble coming because of it, then we'll face it together. Lucas studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right then. After breakfast, Lucas headed out to check on the cattle in the far pasture, taking Henry with him despite the boy's protests that he had lessons to do. Your education can include learning to spot signs of railroad surveyors on our land, Lucas told him. And that ended the argument. Alone in the house, Abigail surveyed her domain properly for the first time. The neglect was even worse in full daylight, but she'd faced worse challenges. She heated water, located what cleaning supplies existed, and set to work with the methodical efficiency that had been drilled into her from childhood. She started with the kitchen scrubbing, years of accumulated grease from the stove scouring the dry sink until it gleamed, and washing the windows until light streamed through unimpeded. As she worked, she hummed hymns and let her mind wander to the strange turns her life had taken. By noon, she'd made significant progress on the main floor. She was just starting on the parlor when she heard horses approaching. Through the newly cleaned window, she saw 3 riders dismounting near the porch. Her stomach clenched when she recognized one of them, Clayton Reeves, whom she'd seen often enough in town during her desperate search for work. The railroad lawyer had a face like a ferret, and a reputation for getting what he wanted regardless of the human cost. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door, not opening it but speaking through the screen. Mr. Boone isn't here at present. You'll need to come back another time. Reeves smiled, all teeth and no warmth. Mrs. Boone isn't it? How delightful. We heard about the judge's little auction yesterday. Quite the sensation you caused. I asked you to leave, Abigail said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Now, no need for hostility. We're here on legitimate business. Reeves pulled out an official-looking document. Surveying orders signed by the territorial governor himself. We have the right to survey this land for potential railroad routes. Then you can discuss it with my husband when he returns. Your husband? Reeves repeated, his tone mocking. Yes, that was quite the performance yesterday. Tell me, Mrs. Boone, how does it feel to go from being worthless to being worth exactly $20? Heat flooded Abigail's face, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the air like a whip crack. I believe my wife asked you to leave. Lucas sat astride his horse at the edge of the yard, his rifle resting across his saddle horn in a way that was both casual and unmistakably threatening. Henry was beside him, his young face set in hard lines that made him look older than his 12 years. Reeves's companion, a rough-looking man with surveying equipment, shifted nervously. The third man, who had the look of hired muscle, moved his hand toward his sidearm, but stopped when Lucas shifted the rifle slightly. Now, Boone, no need for unpleasantness, Reeves said, though his ferret face had gone pale. We have legal documents. Show them to me through my lawyer in town, Lucas said. Until then, you're trespassing. You have 30 seconds to get off my land. You're making a mistake, Boone. The railroad is the future. You can either be part of that future or be crushed beneath it. 20 seconds. Reeves's face flushed red.
You think you're untouchable because of your reputation, because you took in some reject woman and a half-breed brat that just shows how weak you really are. The silence that followed was deafening. Henry's knuckles went white as he gripped his saddle horn, and Abigail saw Lucas's jaw clench so hard she could hear his teeth grind. 10 seconds, Lucas said, his voice deadly quiet. Reeves and his men mounted their horses, but the lawyer couldn't resist a parting shot. This isn't over, Boone. The judge was right about you, too soft-hearted for your own good. It'll be your downfall. They rode off in a cloud of dust, and only then did Abigail realize she'd been holding her breath. Lucas dismounted and came to the porch, his eyes scanning her for any sign of distress. Did they threaten you? Did they try to come inside? No, I'm fine. They just talked. She didn't mention the cruel words about her worth. Some wounds were better left unprobed. Uncle Luke, Henry said, still mounted, they're really going to try to take the ranch, aren't they? Lucas put his hand on the boy's knee. They're going to try. But this land was your aunt's dream, and before that it was where your mother played as a child. We're not giving it up without a fight. That evening, after a supper of beef stew that had both Lucas and Henry asking for seconds, Abigail found herself on the porch with Lucas while Henry did his lessons inside. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. I owe you an apology, Lucas said suddenly. I knew claiming you as my wife would complicate things with Bradock, but I didn't think... I should have warned you it might bring trouble to your door. Our door, Abigail corrected. This is my home now, too, for as long as you'll have me, and I've faced trouble before, Mr. Boone, Lucas. I didn't survive being cast out by my own people just to run at the first sign of difficulty. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. You're stronger than you appear, aren't you? Most women are. We just hide it better. She paused, then asked the question that had been bothering her all day. Why did you really do it? Claim me, I mean. It wasn't just about needing help with the house. Lucas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. When I saw you standing there maintaining your dignity while those fools mocked you, it reminded me of Mary when we first came here. People laughed at her too, said a lady from back east would never survive in Colorado, but she proved them all wrong. He turned to look at Abigail directly. And I suppose I was angry. Angry at Bradock for his cruelty, angry at those men for their small-mindedness, angry at God for taking everything from me and then showing me someone else suffering for no good reason. So you saved me out of anger. Partly, but also... He struggled for words. Henry needs more than I can give him. He needs someone who'll see him as more than just a half-breed orphan. When you told him he belonged here, the look on his face, I knew I'd made the right choice. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear. Inside they could hear Henry struggling with his arithmetic, occasionally muttering Apache words that were probably curses. He's a good boy, Abigail said. The best. Too good for the hand he's been dealt. Lucas stood stretching. I should help him with those numbers. Never was much good at arithmetic myself, but 2 heads are better than 1. Or 3, Abigail suggested, rising as well. I kept the books for my father's farm. I might be able to help. The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and comfortingly familiar. Abigail rose early to prepare breakfast. Lucas and Henry worked the ranch, and she transformed the house bit by bit. The garden, which had been Mary's pride, according to Henry, was beyond salvation for this season, but Abigail cleared it anyway, preparing the soil for next spring. It was while she was working in the garden that she noticed them riders on the ridge overlooking the valley, too far to identify, but clearly watching the ranch. They appeared every day, never coming closer, just observing. She mentioned it to Lucas that evening. His face darkened. Railroad scouts, most likely. Trying to intimidate us, make us nervous. He loaded his rifle and set it by the door. Keep the shotgun handy when we're out working. You know how to use it. My father taught me to hunt, Abigail said. I can handle a gun if needed. Good. I hope it won't come to that, but hope isn't much of a strategy out here. On the 4th day after the confrontation with Reeves, they had another visitor, but this one was welcome. An elderly Apache man rode up to the house, his bearing still proud despite his obvious age. Henry burst from the barn with a cry of joy. Grandfather Chino! The old man dismounted with surprising agility and embraced the boy, speaking rapidly in Apache. Then he looked up at Lucas and Abigail, who had come out to greet him. "Lucas Boone," he said in accented but clear English. "I heard you took a new wife." "Chino, this is Abigail. Abigail, this is Chino Henry's grandfather, his mother's father." Abigail wasn't sure how to greet an Apache elder, so she simply nodded respectfully. "You're welcome in our home." Chino studied her with dark eyes that missed nothing. "You are the Amish woman from the auction, the one they mocked." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Yes. Yet you stand here with dignity and tact. That speaks well of your spirit." He turned to Lucas. "The railroad men have been asking questions in town, offering money for information about your land, your habits, your weaknesses." "Let them ask," Lucas said grimly. "They also ask about old treaties, about who has legitimate claim to the water rights." Chino's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "They will not like the answers they find if they look too closely." "What do you mean?" "This valley was Apache land given in treaty to my people 50 years ago, then taken away, given to settlers, then taken again. The papers are confused, contradictory." He pulled out a leather pouch from his saddlebag. "But I have copies of the original treaties. Your wife's father, Lucas, filed his claim properly with both the territorial government and the Apache Nation as was required then. Your claim is stronger than the railroad knows." Lucas took the papers with reverent care. "Chino, this could save us." "Perhaps. Or it could bring more trouble. The government does not like to be reminded of promises made to Indians." He looked at Henry. "But the boy deserves to keep his land. His mother would want that." They invited Chino to stay for supper, and Abigail quickly prepared a meal, adding extra vegetables and fry bread when Henry mentioned his grandfather's preferences. The old man's presence changed the dynamic in the house, bringing out a side of Henry she hadn't seen before, confident, chattering in a mix of Apache and English, his green eyes bright with happiness. After dinner, Chino told stories of Henry's mother, of the old days before the settlers came, in numbers of mountains that held spirits and streams that sang songs. Abigail found herself captivated not just by the stories, but by the way Lucas listened, really listened with respect and genuine interest. "Your previous wife," Chino said suddenly to Lucas, "she understood these things. She had the gift of seeing beyond surface differences." "Mary was special that way," Lucas agreed softly. "This one," Chino nodded toward Abigail, "she has a similar gift. I see it in how she looks at my grandson, not as half of two things, but as whole unto himself." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. "He's a wonderful boy. Anyone with sense would see that." "Sense is not common," Chino observed dryly, "which is why they call it common sense, I suppose. A joke of language." When Chino left the next morning, he pulled Abigail aside. "There is trouble coming. I feel it in the wind, see it in the flight of birds. But you three together are stronger than those who would harm you. Remember that when the storm breaks." The storm broke 3 days later. Abigail was alone in the house, Lucas and Henry having gone to town for supplies, when she heard riders approaching many riders. Through the window, she counted at least 8 men with Judge Bradock and Clayton Reeves at their head. She grabbed the shotgun Lucas had left, checked it was loaded, and went to the door. "Mrs. Boone," Judge Bradock called out, his voice carrying false cheer, "we've come to serve legal papers. Please ask your husband to come out." "He's not here, as I suspect you already know," Abigail replied, keeping the shotgun visible, but not directly threatening. "Leave your papers on the porch and go." "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way," Reeves said. "These papers must be served directly. We'll wait." "You'll wait off our property," Abigail said firmly. "Our property." Braddock laughed. "My dear woman, that's precisely what's in question. You see, we've discovered some interesting discrepancies in the land records. It seems this ranch might not belong to Mr. Boone after all." "That's a lie. Is it the original claim was filed by one Josiah Boone, Lucas's father, but Josiah Boone died before completing the required improvements to validate the claim. Lucas continued the work, but legally the claim should have been refiled. It never was." Abigail's mind raced. She remembered the papers Chino had given them, but those were hidden in the house. Even if that were true, squatters' rights only apply if no one else has a competing claim, Reeves interrupted smoothly.
and the railroad company filed a claim on this land 6 months ago, anticipating just such a situation. "You're trying to steal our land," Abigail said flatly. Such harsh words. Bradock tutted. "We're simply ensuring that the law is followed. Of course, we might be willing to overlook these technical matters if Mr. Boone were more cooperative. Cooperative meaning letting you have our water rights. A small price for keeping the ranch. Don't you think?" Before Abigail could respond, she heard horses approaching at a gallop. Lucas and Henry appeared riding hard, and she realized with a sinking heart that someone in town must have warned them about Bradock's visit. Lucas pulled up short when he saw the assembled men, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "Judge Reeves, to what do we owe this pleasure?" "Mr. Boone," Bradock said with false courtesy. "We were just explaining to your wife about the unfortunate situation with your land claim." "There's no situation. This land is mine." "Actually, that's debatable," Reeves said, pulling out his sheaf of papers. "Would you like to resolve this here or in court?" "Court," Lucas said immediately. "We'll see you in court." "Excellent choice. The hearing is set for next week. Until then, you're required to cease all improvements to the property and allow our surveyors access." "Like hell I will." "Then you'll be in contempt before the hearing even begins. Is that really the position you want to take?" Lucas's jaw worked furiously, but Abigail could see him calculating, weighing options. "Supervised access. Your surveyors can come, but only with me present." "Acceptable," Reeves said quickly, too quickly. "We'll begin tomorrow." After they left, Lucas slumped in his saddle like a man defeated. They planned this. They've been planning it all along. "We have Chino's papers," Henry reminded him. "The treaties with Indians don't hold much weight in territorial court," Lucas said bitterly, "not with Bradock presiding." "Then we need other proof," Abigail said. "Lucas, where are your father's papers?" "The original claim documents. In the strongbox in the barn, but I've looked at them a dozen times. The claim was filed properly." "May I see them?" Lucas looked at her curiously, but nodded. They spent the rest of the day going through every scrap of paper, every receipt, every document related to the ranch. It was Abigail who found it tucked behind another paper, as if hidden deliberately, a receipt for refiling the claim dated just weeks after Josiah Boone's death, signed by the territorial registrar. "Lucas, look at this." He studied the receipt, his eyes widening. "This proves we refiled, but why don't they have record of it?" "Because someone made that record disappear," Abigail said. "The question is, can we prove it?" "The registrar who signed this died 2 years ago," Lucas said, "but his widow might have his records. She lives in Denver now." "Then someone needs to go to Denver." Lucas shook his head. "It's a 3-day ride each way. I can't leave the ranch that long, not with surveyors coming." "I'll go," Henry offered. "Absolutely not," Lucas and Abigail said in unison. "Then I'll go," Abigail said. "A woman traveling alone won't raise suspicions the way a man might." "It's too dangerous," Lucas protested. "More dangerous than losing the ranch." Abigail met his eyes steadily. "I'm not the delicate flower everyone assumes I am because of my size. I can handle a wagon, and I can handle myself." They argued about it through supper and into the evening, but eventually Lucas had to admit she was right. She was their best chance. That night, as she prepared for the journey, packing food and checking the wagon, Lucas came to her room. It was the first time he'd entered since showing it to her that first day. "Abigail, Be careful. Please." "I will." He stood there awkwardly, clearly wanting to say more. Finally, he pulled out a small revolver. "This was Mary's. She knew how to use it, and I suspect you do too. Take it." Abigail took the gun, touched by the gesture. "I'll bring back the proof we need, I promise." "Just come back safely," he said roughly. "That's all I ask." She left before dawn, driving the wagon with determined purpose. The journey to Denver was arduous, following rough roads through mountain passes and across rivers. She stopped only when necessary, sleeping in the wagon, always aware that she might be followed. Denver was overwhelming after months in small towns, a bustling city of over 100,000 people, with electric streetlights and buildings that seemed to scrape the sky. She found the registrar's widow, Mrs. Catherine Hartley, living in a modest boarding house on the outskirts of the city.
Mrs. Hartley was a thin, nervous woman who initially refused to see her, but when Abigail mentioned Judge Bradock's name, the woman's face went pale. "Come in quickly," she said, pulling Abigail into her small room. "Are you one of his victims, too?" Victims. That man destroyed my husband. Charles had proof that Bradock was taking bribes from the railroad, destroying land records, forging documents. When Charles tried to report it, Bradock had him dismissed, ruined his reputation. The stress killed him within a year. "Mrs. Hartley, do you still have your husband's records?" The woman's eyes darted nervously. "Why?" Abigail explained about the ranch, about the refiling, about the receipt. Mrs. Hartley listened, then went to a trunk in the corner. She pulled out a ledger thick with entries. Charles kept copies of everything. He was meticulous that way. She flipped through pages, then stopped. "Here. Lucas Boone refiling of claim originally filed by Josiah Boone. Approved and registered." She looked up at Abigail. "This proves your husband's claim is valid." "Would you testify to that in court?" Fear flashed across the woman's face. I can't. Bradock has too much power. He'd destroy me like he did Charles." "Mrs. Hartley, please. He's trying to steal our home. My husband took me in when no one else would give me dignity, when the whole world was mocking me. I can't let him lose everything because of it." Something in Abigail's words seemed to reach the woman. She was quiet for a long moment, then straightened her shoulders. "Charles would be ashamed of me hiding here while that man continues his crimes. Yes, I'll testify, but we'll need protection." "You'll have it," Abigail promised, hoping she could deliver on that promise. The journey back was tense, with Mrs. Hartley jumpy at every sound. They were a day out from San Miguel when Abigail spotted riders following them. She pushed the horses harder, but the wagon was slow and the riders were gaining. They came at them in a narrow canyon, 4 men with bandanas over their faces. But Abigail had been expecting something like this. She pulled the wagon to a stop and stood up, Mary's revolver in one hand, the shotgun in the other. "That's close enough," she called out. The men laughed. "Look at that, boys. The fat Amish woman thinks she's Annie Oakley." "I don't want to hurt anyone," Abigail said calmly. "But I will if you force me to." 4 against 1. "You like those odds, lady?" "I like them fine," came a voice from the rocks above. Chino stood there with a rifle, and beside him were 2 younger Apache men also armed. "But 4 against 5 seems more fair, don't you think?" The bandits looked around nervously. Apache fighters had a fearsome reputation, and these 3 looked more than capable of living up to it. "This ain't your fight, Indian," one of the bandits said. "My grandson's inheritance is at stake. That makes it my fight." Chino's voice was conversational, but his rifle never wavered. "You can leave now, or you can stay forever. Choose quickly." The bandits chose wisely, riding off with considerably less swagger than they'd arrived with. Chino and his companions escorted them the rest of the way to the ranch. When they arrived, Lucas ran out, relief clear on his face when he saw them all safe. "How did you know?" Abigail asked Chino. "The birds told me," he said with a slight smile. "Also, Henry sent word that you'd gone to Denver. I thought you might need watching over on the way back." The hearing was 2 days later. The courthouse was packed, word having spread about the dispute. Judge Bradock presided with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly believing he had the case won before it began. Reeves presented his case first, laying out the supposed deficiencies in the Boone claim with lawyerly precision. He had documents, witnesses, everything needed to paint a picture of invalid ownership. Then it was Lucas's turn. He'd hired the only lawyer in town willing to oppose Bradock, a young man named James Morrison, who was either very brave or very foolish. "Your Honor," Morrison began, "we have evidence that the claim was properly refiled." "Oh," Braddock's voice dripped skepticism. "And what evidence would that be?" Abigail stood up. "May I approach, Your Honor?" Braddock's eyes narrowed. "This is highly irregular. You're not a lawyer, Mrs. Boone." "No, but I'm a witness, and I have another witness who can verify our evidence." She helped Mrs. Hartley to her feet. The woman was trembling, but her voice was clear when she spoke. "Your Honor, I am Catherine Hartley, widow of Charles Hartley, former territorial registrar. I have here my husband's official ledger showing that the Boone claim was properly refiled." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Braddock's face went red, then purple. Those are not official documents. They have no standing. Actually, Your Honor, Tim, Morrison interrupted. Territorial law states that copies maintained by the registrar are considered valid legal documents, especially when the originals have been lost or destroyed. This is preposterous. Reeves stood up. These could be forgeries.
Then perhaps, came another voice from the back of the room, you'd like to explain why you paid Harold Simmons $500 to destroy the original filing. Everyone turned to see a thin, nervous-looking man standing in the doorway. Harold Simmons, the current territorial registrar. I can't be part of this anymore. Simmons continued, his voice growing stronger. Judge Bradock and Mr. Reeves paid me to destroy records to forge documents. I have proof receipts, telegrams, everything. Bradock stood up, his face apoplectic. This is a conspiracy. These people are lying. Your Honor, Morrison said calmly, addressing Bradock directly. Given your apparent personal involvement in this case, I move that you recuse yourself and call for a federal judge to review the matter. The courtroom held its breath. Bradock's hand actually moved toward the gun at his hip, and for a moment violence seemed inevitable. Then Chino stood up in the gallery, followed by his Apache companions, then Lucas, then Henry. One by one, other ranchers stood too. Men who'd had their own run-ins with Bradock's corruption, but had been too afraid to act alone. It's over, Bradock, Lucas said quietly. You've stolen your last ranch. What followed was swift. Federal marshals were called in. Bradock and Reeves were arrested, though both would later flee before trial. Simmons testified in exchange for leniency. The Boone Ranch claim was upheld and water rights confirmed. But the victory felt hollow that night as they sat around the dinner table. Justice had been served, but enemies had been made, and in the frontier such enemies rarely forgot. They'll be back, Lucas said quietly. Maybe not Bradock and Reeves specifically, but others like them. The railroad won't give up. Then we'll face them when they come, Abigail said firmly. Together. Henry raised his glass of milk in a mock toast. To the Boone family, too stubborn to know when we're beat. To family, Lucas corrected, looking at Abigail with something warm in his eyes. However it comes to be. The weeks following the trial brought an uneasy peace to the ranch. Word of Bradock's corruption and flight had spread through the county like wildfire, and with it came a newfound respect for the Boones. Neighbors who had once looked away when Lucas rode past now tipped their hats, and women who had snickered at Abigail's size during that terrible auction now nodded politely when she came to town for supplies. But respect born from fear wasn't trust, and Abigail could feel the undercurrents of tension whenever she walked down Main Street. The railroad company hadn't given up, they'd simply retreated to regroup. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they tried again. It was during this tense lull that Henry came to her one evening while she was mending Lucas's work shirt by lamplight. The boy had been quieter than usual since the trial, and she'd been waiting for him to speak his mind. Aunt Abigail, he said, then stopped, color flooding his copper-toned cheeks. I mean, Mrs. Boone, I'm sorry, I didn't mean— Abigail is fine, she said gently, setting down her sewing. Or Aunt Abigail, if you prefer. Both sound nice to me. He smiled that rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. Uncle Luke says you're the bravest woman he's ever known, going to Denver like that, facing down those bandits. Your uncle exaggerates. I was terrified the entire time. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, isn't it? Being afraid, but doing what needs to be done. She studied his young face, seeing the weight he carried. What's troubling you, Henry? He fidgeted with the corner of the tablecloth. Some of the town kids, they're saying things about how the trial was fixed, how we cheated, how an Indian's testimony shouldn't count in court. They say we're going to get what's coming to us. Abigail's hand stilled on the fabric. Which children said this? It doesn't matter. They're just repeating what their parents say at home. He looked up at her with those striking green eyes. Are we safe here? Really safe? She wanted to lie to give him the comfort that children deserved, but Henry had seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in pretty falsehoods. I don't know, she admitted, but I do know that we're together, and that makes us stronger than those who would harm us. My mother used to say something similar.
Henry said quietly. Before she died, she told me that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stand with you when standing alone would be easier. Your mother was a wise woman. Uncle Luke doesn't talk about her much. It hurts him, I think, like how he doesn't talk about Aunt Mary or Cousin Thomas. Abigail had learned about Lucas's son only in fragments, a toy soldier she'd found while cleaning a small shirt tucked away in a trunk, a grave marker on the hill that Lucas visited every Sunday but never spoke about. Grief is like that sometimes, she said carefully. It's not that we don't want to remember. It's that remembering feels like reopening a wound that's barely healed. Do you have wounds like that from your family? The question caught her off guard. She thought of her father dying of shame as much as pneumonia, her mother fading away like morning mist, her sister Martha, who hadn't even said goodbye. Yes, she said simply. I do. But you still sing their hymns. I hear you sometimes early in the morning. Because the faith isn't the people who failed me. The songs, the prayers, the beliefs, those are still mine, even if the community cast me out. She picked up her sewing again. Just like your Apache heritage is still yours, even if you can't live among your mother's people. Henry was quiet for a moment, then said, Grandfather Chino wants to teach me the old ways, hunting, tracking the stories of our people. But Uncle Luke, I don't think he'd approve. Have you asked him? No. Then how do you know? When Henry didn't answer, she continued, Your uncle loves you more than you might realize. Trust him with your truths, Henry. He might surprise you. As if summoned by the conversation, Lucas appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. Am I interrupting? Not at all, Abigail said. Henry was just keeping me company while I mend your shirt, the one you tore on the fence wire, despite my repeated warnings about checking for loose nails. Lucas had the grace to look sheepish. In my defense, the cow was getting away. The cow got away anyway, Henry pointed out, grinning. Details, Lucas muttered, but he was smiling too. He sat down at the table, his long frame folding into the chair with a weariness that concerned Abigail. He'd been working too hard trying to make up for the time lost during the trial. There's stew keeping warm on the stove, she told him. In a moment. He looked at Henry. Your grandfather came by the north pasture today. He wants to know if you'd like to go hunting with him this weekend, learn some of the traditional ways. Henry's eyes widened. Really? You'd let me... Your mother would want you to know both sides of your heritage. I should have encouraged it sooner, but... Lucas trailed off, then started again. I was afraid, I suppose. Afraid that if you learned your mother's ways, you might leave like she did. Mom didn't leave, and... Henry said, confused. She died. Before that, when she married your father, she left the ranch, left us. I was angry about it for a long time, felt like she was choosing them over us. Lucas rubbed his face tiredly. It was foolish and selfish, and I regret it. She was choosing love, choosing her own path. I should have supported her. Is that why you helped Aunt Abigail? Henry asked suddenly. Because you couldn't help Mom when she needed it. Lucas looked startled, then thoughtful. Maybe partly. I hadn't thought of it that way. Well, I'm glad you did, Henry said firmly. We needed her. The simple statement hung in the air like a blessing. Abigail felt her eyes burn with unshed tears and quickly returned to her sewing. Lucas cleared his throat roughly. Yes, he said quietly. We did. The next morning brought trouble in the form of unexpected visitors. Abigail was hanging laundry when she saw the small procession approaching a covered wagon escorted by 2 riders. Her stomach clenched when she recognized one of the riders as Reverend Michaels from town, a man who'd made his disapproval of their unholy arrangement clear to anyone who would listen. But it was the wagon's occupants that made her heart stop. An Amish couple in traditional dress, the man's beard long and gray, the woman's face hidden beneath her bonnet. Behind them, barely visible, sat a younger woman. No, Abigail breathed, recognizing them even at a distance. Elder Stoltzfus and his wife, and with them, Martha. Lucas emerged from the barn. Henry beside him, both alerted by the approaching strangers. He moved to stand beside Abigail, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his solid presence. Do you know them? He asked quietly. My sister, she managed. and the elder who cast me out. Lucas's hand moved to his sidearm, a gesture so protective it made her heart ache. They're not welcome here if they've come to cause you pain. Let's hear what they have to say first. The wagon pulled up in the yard. Elder Stoltzfus climbed down first, his movement stiff with age and righteousness. His wife followed, then Martha, who wouldn't meet Abigail's eyes. Abigail Yoder, the elder began in Pennsylvania Dutch. Abigail Boone, Lucas corrected firmly in English. My wife. And on my land we speak English so everyone can understand. The elder's face flushed, but he switched languages. Mrs. Boone, we have come on a matter of importance. If you've come to condemn her further, you can turn around right now, Lucas said, his voice dangerously quiet. We've come to offer her redemption, the elder said, his tone suggesting he was bestowing a great gift. Her sister Martha is to be married to a good Amish man, but the shame of Abigail's situation living in sin with an English man threatens the match. If Abigail will come with us now, confess her sins before the community, and accept her punishment, she can be restored to fellowship. Living in sin. Lucas took a step forward. We're legally married. A marriage without God's blessing performed by a corrupt judge in a den of iniquity, the elder replied dismissively. It is no marriage at all in the eyes of the Lord. And what punishment would I face? Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. 6 weeks of shunning within the community, then restoration to partial fellowship. You would live with the widow Fisher, help with her farm, and in time perhaps marry her son Jacob. Jacob Fisher is 60 years old and simple-minded, Abigail said flatly. He is a child of God who needs a strong woman to care for him. It would be an act of charity that might cleanse your soul of its current corruption. Henry made a sound of disgust. You want her to leave us to go be a servant to some old man? Children should not speak in matters of faith, Elder Stoltzfus said sharply. Then his eyes narrowed as he took in Henry's appearance. Especially heathen children of mixed blood. The change in Lucas was instantaneous. The quiet rancher transformed into something dangerous, his hand gripping his gun. Get off my land, now. Abigail. Martha spoke for the first time, her voice pleading. Please, come home. Ask forgiveness. Don't you see what this is doing to me, to our family's memory? Abigail looked at her younger sister, still beautiful, still untouched by the hardships that had aged Abigail beyond her years. What it's doing to you, Martha, when they cast me out, you had a choice. You could have stood with me. Instead, you turned your back like all the others. I had no choice. There's always a choice. I chose to survive. I chose to take the help that was offered when our own people left me to starve, and I choose to stay here with my husband and nephew in this home we're building together. You choose damnation, Elder Stoltzfus said harshly. I choose love, Abigail countered. The kind of love Christ actually preached, accepting the outcast, feeding the hungry, sheltering those in need. When did you last do any of those things, Elder? When did you last show mercy instead of judgment? Do not dare to lecture me on Scripture, woman. You who have fallen so far. She's fallen nowhere. Lucas interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. She's risen. Despite everything you and your kind did to break her, she's risen. She's brought light back to this home, given my nephew a mother's love, and shown more Christian charity in 3 months than you've probably shown in your lifetime. Pretty words from a man who profits from her shame, the elder sneered. That was too much for Henry. Before anyone could stop him, the boy stepped forward. Aunt Abigail isn't shameful. She's good and kind and brave. She makes Uncle Luke smile again, and she teaches me arithmetic without making me feel stupid. And she stood up to bad men who tried to steal our home. You're the shameful ones coming here to hurt her when she's finally happy. Henry, Abigail said softly, touched by his fierce defense. Elder Stoltzfus looked at the boy with undisguised contempt. The child of savages speaks of shame. How fitting. The gun was in Lucas's hand before anyone could blink, pointed directly at the elder's chest. I've killed men for less than that. Much less. Lucas, no, Abigail said, placing her hand on his arm. She felt the trembling tension in his muscles, the barely leashed violence. They're not worth it. Listen to her. Reverend Michaels spoke for the first time, his face pale. Mr. Boone, please. Violence won't solve anything. Won't it? Lucas asked conversationally, though the gun never wavered. Seems to me that violent men like you, and yes, Reverend, cruelty is violence, even when it comes wrapped in scripture, only understand one language. But my wife is right. You're not worth the bullet. He lowered the gun slowly. You have 1 minute to get off my land. If you ever come back, if you ever approach my wife again, if you so much as look at her wrong in town, I'll forget her mercy and remember my own nature. And Reverend, make sure everyone in town knows that. The Boones protect their own. Elder Stoltzfus climbed back onto the wagon with as much dignity as he could muster. Martha looked back, once tears streaming down her face, but Abigail had already turned away. Some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. As the wagon disappeared down the road, Abigail found herself shaking. Lucas's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You shouldn't have had to face that. But I did face it, she said, leaning into his strength. With you beside me. We were all beside you, Henry corrected, inserting himself into their embrace with the determination of youth. That's what family does. That night, after Henry had gone to bed, Abigail found Lucas on the porch, staring out at the stars. She sat beside him, comfortable now with their evening ritual. Thank you, she said, for defending me today. You defended yourself. I just provided armed support. She laughed softly. Would you really have shot him? For calling Henry a savage, yes. His voice was matter-of-fact. For hurting you without question. I'm not sure that's very Christian of you. Good thing I'm not much of a Christian, then. They sat in silence for a moment before Abigail spoke again. What they said about our marriage not being real. Do you believe that? She thought about it carefully. I believe God sees the truth of things, not the ceremony around them. We stood before witnesses and made vows. We've honored those vows each in our own way. That feels real to me. It feels real to me too, Lucas admitted. More real than I expected when I made that impulsive decision at the courthouse. Do you regret it? The decision. He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see something shifting in his expression. No. Do you? No. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Neither was quite ready to explore, but something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed. The next few days passed peacefully, but it was the peace before a storm. Abigail could feel it in the air, see it in the way Lucas checked his guns more frequently, and how Henry stayed closer to the house. Even the animals seemed restless. It was Henry who saw them first, riders approaching from the east, a dozen men in railroad company uniforms led by a man Abigail didn't recognize. He was younger than Reeves, harder looking, with the bearing of a former soldier. Get inside, Lucas told Abigail and Henry, but they both ignored him, standing firm on the porch as the riders approached. The leader dismounted with military precision. Mr. Boone, I'm James Crawford, new legal representative for the Mountain Pacific Railroad Company. I'm here to discuss a business proposition. Not interested, Lucas said flatly. You haven't heard the offer yet. Crawford pulled out a leather folder. $50,000 for your water rights. You keep the land, the house, everything else. Just grant us access to the creek and the right to divert water as needed. Henry gasped. It was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Not interested, Lucas repeated. Crawford's pleasant expression didn't change. That's a generous offer, Mr. Boone. More than generous, considering your recent legal troubles. The railroad has a long memory, and while Bradock and Reeves may have overstepped, their essential argument wasn't wrong. This land would serve better purposes than cattle ranching. Better for who? For progress. For civilization? The railroad brings prosperity. Mr. Sir, Deputy Sister. Boone, towns grow, businesses flourish, people prosper. And farms dry up when you divert all the water. Other ranchers go under when you dam the creek. I've seen your version of progress, Crawford. It leaves a desert behind it. Crawford's smile tightened. You're being short-sighted. The offer won't remain open indefinitely. Good. Then we won't have to have this conversation again. Actually, we will. You see, the territorial government has granted the railroad company eminent domain rights for essential infrastructure. We'd prefer to purchase your cooperation, but if necessary, we can simply take what we need. Try it, Lucas said quietly. See what happens. Crawford studied him for a moment, then his gaze shifted to Abigail. Mrs. Boone, I heard about your performance at the trial. Quite impressive for a woman of your background. My background is a farm woman who understands the value of water and land. Yes, I suppose it would be impressive to someone who values only money. I was referring to your background as someone who was sold at auction like livestock. One would think you'd appreciate the security that $50,000 could provide. The insult was calculated, designed to provoke. But before Lucas could react, Abigail stepped forward. I wasn't sold, Mr. Crawford. I was rescued. My husband saw value where others saw only mockery. He offered dignity where others offered shame. That's worth more than any amount of money you could name. How touchingly romantic. And the boy? Does he feel the same way about this noble poverty you're choosing? Henry lifted his chin. I'd rather be poor and free than rich and owned by the railroad. Crawford laughed, but there was no humor in it. Children and their idealism. You'll learn, boy. Everyone has a price. Maybe, Lucas said, but you can't afford ours. Crawford mounted his horse. We'll see about that. The railroad always gets what it needs, Mr. Boone, one way or another. After they left, Lucas immediately began preparing for trouble. He sent word to Chino, alerting him to the threat. He rode to neighboring ranches, warning them about Crawford's visit. Most were sympathetic, but unwilling to take a stand. The railroad was too powerful, had too much influence. But Tom Garrett, whose ranch bordered theirs to the north, offered his support. They came to me last month, he said. Offered me half what they offered you. When I refused, they cut my fence lines, let my cattle wander, lost 20 head before I could round them up. Why didn't you report it? To who? The sheriff's in their pocket. The judge is gone, but his replacement isn't much better. Face it, Lucas, we're on our own out here. That night, Abigail was awakened by the smell of smoke. She rushed to the window to see the barn ablaze, flames already consuming the hayloft. Fire! She screamed, running to wake the others. They formed a bucket brigade, desperately trying to save what they could. The horses had already been let out. Whoever set the fire had at least that much mercy, but the winter hay supply was lost along with most of their tools and equipment. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Crawford appeared again, this time alone. Terrible tragedy, he said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. These old barns so susceptible to accidents. The offer stands, Boone. Take it before something worse happens. Get out, Lucas said, his voice deadly quiet. And know this, whatever happens next is on your head. Crawford smiled. I'll take my chances. But as he rode away, Henry tugged on Lucas's sleeve. Uncle Luke, look. Coming down from the hills were riders, Apache warriors, led by Chino. But more surprisingly, coming from the other direction were their neighbors Tom Garrett and 3 other ranchers, all armed. Heard you had some trouble, Garrett said simply. Figured you might need help rebuilding. The boy sent word, Chino added, nodding to Henry. Family helps family. As Abigail looked around at the gathering Apache and white ranchers and warriors all united in common cause, she felt something powerful stirring. Crawford and the railroad had made a miscalculation. They thought the Boones were alone, isolated. They were wrong. We rebuild, Lucas said firmly, and we watch. They want a fight. We'll give them one. The barn raising became an event. Women from neighboring ranches arrived with food men with lumber and tools. Even some townspeople came, those who'd grown tired of the railroad's bullying. Reverend Michaels appeared, surprising everyone, carrying a hammer and wearing work clothes. I owe you an apology, he said to Abigail. I let prejudice cloud my judgment. What I've seen here, different people working together, helping each other. This is what Christian community should look like. By sunset, the frame of a new barn stood against the sky, larger and stronger than the old one. People lingered, sharing food and stories, and for the first time since arriving in Colorado, Abigail felt part of something bigger than just their small household. That night, as she and Lucas stood looking at their new barn, he took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her deliberately, not out of necessity, but choice. We're going to win this, he said. How can you be sure? Because we have something they don't understand. We have each other. We have community. We have roots here that go deeper than any railroad track. She squeezed his hand. And we have love. He looked at her sharply. Abigail, not necessarily romantic love, she said quickly, though her heart was racing, but love nonetheless. For this land, for Henry, for the life we're building. That's powerful. Yes, he agreed softly. It is. The next attack came 3 nights later. This time it wasn't fire, but fence cutting. Miles of fence line destroyed, cattle scattered, but they were ready. Chino's warriors tracked the culprits, caught them in the act of cutting Tom Garrett's fences. The men were railroad-hired guns, and faced with Apache fighters, they quickly confessed that Crawford had ordered the destruction. Lucas took the confession to the federal marshal in Denver, along with a petition signed by every rancher in the valley. The federal government, it turned out, was getting tired of the railroad company's overreach. An investigation was launched. Crawford arrived at the ranch one last time, his composure finally cracked. You think you've won? The railroad has more lawyers than you have cattle. We'll bury you in legal proceedings until you beg to sell. Maybe, Lucas said, but every document will be public record. Every dirty trick, every bribe, every threat. The newspapers will love it. The railroad's reputation will be ruined. You're nobody Boone, a failed rancher with a fat wife and a half-breed nephew. Who's going to care what happens to you? This time it was Abigail who stepped forward. Everyone who's ever been stepped on by men like you. Everyone who's been told they don't matter. We're not nobody, Mr. Crawford. We're everybody. And there are more of us than there are of you. Crawford left without another word, but they all knew it wasn't over. The railroad would retreat, regroup, try again. But for now they had won a victory. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, their extended family, now with Chino visiting more often, and neighbors dropping by regularly, Henry raised his glass of milk in another toast. To the Boone Ranch, may it stand forever. To family, Lucas corrected, as he always did, but this time his eyes were on Abigail when he said it. To love, Abigail added softly, and was rewarded with Lucas's rare, genuine smile. Outside the rebuilt barn stood strong against the darkening sky, a symbol of what could be accomplished when people stood together. The fight wasn't over. Might never truly be over, but they were ready for whatever came next. Chino, watching from his place at the table, nodded approvingly. The spirits had been right. These 3 broken people had indeed become something whole, something stronger than the sum of their parts. And in the process, they had begun to heal not just themselves, but their entire community. The federal investigation moved with the speed of molasses in January, but its very existence had given them breathing room. Crawford and his men had pulled back, waiting to see which way the political winds would blow. It was during this uneasy peace that winter arrived early, bringing with it the worst blizzard the valley had seen in a decade. Abigail woke to a world transformed into white silence, snow piled so high against the windows that the house was cast in an eerie twilight, despite it being mid-morning. Lucas was already up. She could hear him moving around downstairs, and the worried tone of his voice as he spoke with Henry sent her hurrying to dress. She found them in the kitchen, both bundled in heavy coats. The cattle, Lucas was saying, if they're still in the north pasture, they'll freeze. We have to get them to shelter. You can't go out in this, Abigail protested, looking at the wall of white outside the window. You won't be able to see 5 feet in front of you. We don't have a choice. Those cattle are everything we have left. Without them, we won't make it through to spring. Lucas was already wrapping a scarf around his face. Henry, you stay here with— I'm coming with you, the boy interrupted. You need help, and I know the north pasture as well as you do. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Everything we do is dangerous, Henry shot back. At least this is danger from weather, not men. I'm coming. Abigail watched them argue, these 2 stubborn males who'd become her world, and made a decision. We're all going. 3 people can move the herd better than 2, and if something happens, there's safety in numbers. Abigail, no. Lucas Boone. I have worked farms in Pennsylvania winters that would make this look like a spring rain. I'm not some delicate flower to be protected. Now we're wasting daylight arguing when we should be saving cattle. 20 minutes later, they were trudging through snow that came up to Abigail's waist in places. They'd roped themselves together, Lucas leading Henry in the middle, Abigail bringing up the rear. The wind screamed around them like a living thing driving ice crystals that felt like tiny knives against any exposed skin. They found the cattle huddled against a rock formation, already starting to suffer from the cold. Several calves were down and Abigail's heart sank. They couldn't afford to lose any of their remaining herd. "We'll never get them all back," Lucas shouted over the wind. "Not in this." "The old mine shaft," Henry yelled back. "It's closer than the barn and it'll give them shelter." Lucas hesitated. The abandoned mine was on their property, but it was unstable, dangerous. Yet looking at the cattle at the wall of snow between them and home, he nodded. Moving the herd in a blizzard was nightmarish work. The cattle didn't want to move, were already settling into the fatal lethargy that preceded freezing. Abigail found herself wrestling with animals that weighed 10 times what she did, using every trick her father had taught her about managing livestock. Her skirts heavy with snow tangled around her legs, and more than once she fell, pulling herself up by sheer determination. It was Henry who saved them. The boy had an almost mystical connection with animals, something from his Apache heritage perhaps, and he managed to get the lead cow moving. Where she went, the others followed, and slowly, agonizingly, they drove the herd toward the mine. The entrance was partially collapsed, but there was enough room to get the cattle inside. The shaft opened into a larger chamber about 30 feet in, and while it smelled of must and old rock, it was dry and significantly warmer than outside. "We can't leave them here alone," Lucas said once they'd gotten all the animals inside. "If the entrance collapses further, they'll be trapped." "Then we stay," Abigail said simply. They made camp in the mine entrance, using their bodies to block the wind and keep the cattle from trying to leave. Henry gathered what dry wood he could find deeper in the mine, and they managed a small fire. As night fell and the storm raged on, they huddled together, taking turns staying awake to tend the fire and watch the cattle. It was during Abigail's watch that she heard a groaning from deeper in the mine, the sound of rock under pressure. She woke Lucas immediately. "The storms weighed on the mountain," he said grimly. "This whole shaft could come down. Should we try to get out?" He looked at the wall of white outside, then at the cattle, finally at Henry sleeping between them. "We take our chances here. At least we have shelter." They didn't sleep the rest of the night, listening to the mountain groan around them. Abigail found herself praying in Pennsylvania Dutch, the old words coming back like muscle memory. Lucas's arm was around her shoulders. Henry pressed against her other side, and she thought that if this was how it ended, at least they were together. But morning came, and with it, trugnance. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and new. They emerged from the mine like bears from hibernation, blinking in the brilliant sunlight. The cattle followed, lowing complaints, but alive, all of them. The trek back to the ranch revealed the storm's damage. Part of the new barn's roof had collapsed under the snow weight. Fences were down everywhere. But the house stood strong, smoke rising from the chimney where they'd left the fire banked. They spent the day dealing with immediate needs, fixing the barn enough to shelter the cattle, melting snow for water, checking on the horses. It wasn't until evening, exhausted and finally warm, that they realized what had happened in the mine. "We could have died," Henry said suddenly over dinner. "All of us, we could have died." "But we didn't," Lucas said firmly. "Because we were together," Abigail added. "Because we trusted each other." Henry looked between them, something shifting in his young face. "You two are different now. With each other, I mean." Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Lucas met the boy's gaze steadily. "Yes," he said simply. "We are." That night after Henry had gone to bed, Lucas lingered in the kitchen while Abigail cleaned up from dinner. The air between them was charged with something new, something that had been building for months but had crystallized in those hours in the mine. "Abigail," he began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm no good at this. At saying what I mean. Mary always said I was better with horses than words." He took a breath. "What I'm trying to say is when I thought we might die in that mine, my biggest regret wasn't about the ranch or the cattle or even the fight with the railroad. It was that I'd never told you, that I'd never thanked you properly." "You don't need to thank me, Lucas. We have an arrangement. To hell with the arrangement." The vehemence in his voice startled them both. "Sorry, I didn't mean to curse, but Abigail, this stopped being just an arrangement months ago, at least for me." She stood very still, afraid that if she moved this moment would shatter. "What are you saying?" He crossed to her, took her hands in his work-roughened ones. "I'm saying that when you stood up to Crawford, when you defended Henry from those awful men, when you wrestled cattle in a blizzard, I'm saying that somewhere along the way I stopped seeing you as someone I was helping and started seeing you as someone I couldn't imagine living without. Lucas, I know I'm not what you probably dreamed of. I'm older, set in my ways, still carrying ghosts. And I know our marriage was born of necessity, not love. But Abigail, if you could find it in your heart to let this become real, truly real." She silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "It's already real. It has been for some time. I love you, Lucas Boone. Not because you saved me, not out of gratitude, but because you're a good man who's shown me that second chances are possible." He pulled her into his arms then, and their first kiss was gentle, tentative, flavored with coffee and promise. When they pulled apart, both were trembling slightly. "I love you too," he said against her hair. "God help me, I didn't think I could love again after Mary, but you've proven me wrong." "I'm not Mary," Abigail felt compelled to say. "I'll never be as delicate or refined." "You're Abigail," he interrupted firmly. "Strong, brave, beautiful Abigail. I don't want you to be Mary. I want you to be exactly who you are." They might have stood there forever holding each other in the lamplit kitchen, but a sound from outside made them both freeze. Horses, several of them, approaching fast. Lucas grabbed his rifle, pushing Abigail behind him as he moved to the window. But instead of Crawford's men, he saw Tom Garrett riding hard with 2 other ranchers behind him. "Lucas," Garrett called out, "we've got trouble." They rushed outside to meet them. Garrett was breathless, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold. "What's happened?" Lucas demanded. "The railroads made their move, but not here. They're going after the Apache settlement. Crawford's claiming the land Chino's people winter on is abandoned and filing for immediate possession. They've got a judge in Denver who'll sign anything for the right price. The winter settlement. But there are families there, children." "Exactly. And if they control that land, they control the headwaters of the creek. Every ranch in the valley will be at their mercy." Lucas was already moving toward the barn. "We ride tonight." "I'm coming," Henry said from the doorway, fully dressed. "How long were you listening?" Abigail asked. "Long enough, Bo?" The boy said, his face grim. "Those are my people, too. My mother's people." "It's too dangerous," Lucas began. "Everything's dangerous, Fitz," Henry repeated his earlier argument. "But this is worth the danger." They rode through the night, a small band of ranchers heading to defend people most of them had feared or hated not long ago. Abigail rode beside Lucas, having refused to stay behind. She'd never been comfortable on horseback, but determination made up for skill. They reached the Apache winter camp just as dawn was breaking. It was chaos. Railroad men were trying to serve eviction papers while Apache warriors stood firm, refusing to move. Women and children huddled near the lodges, and Abigail could see the fear in their faces. Crawford was there, backed by hired guns and a nervous-looking man in a judge's robes, clearly brought along to give a veneer of legality to what amounted to theft. "You have no authority here," Chino was saying, his dignity intact despite being surrounded by armed men. "This land was promised to us by treaty." "Treaties that were never properly ratified," Crawford replied smoothly. "Judge Morrison here has reviewed the documents. This land reverted to public domain years ago. The railroad has filed proper claim." "That's a lie," Lucas called out, riding into the midst of the confrontation. "And you know it, Crawford." Crawford's face darkened when he saw them. "This doesn't concern you, Boone. Everything in this valley concerns me. These are my neighbors, my family." He looked at Chino, then at Henry, who had ridden straight to his grandfather's side. "You want to steal from them, you go through us first." "There are laws," the judge began nervously. "Don't talk to me about law," Tom Garrett interrupted, he and the other ranchers forming a line beside Lucas. "We know what kind of law you practice, the kind that's bought and paid for." Crawford looked around, calculating odds. His hired guns were outnumbered now, and more importantly, the Apache warriors were armed and ready. But he had one more card to play. "Fine. You want to make this about more than just the Apache? I have federal marshals on the way. They'll be here within the hour. Anyone interfering with the lawful execution of a court order will be arrested. He smiled coldly. How does federal prison sound, Boone? Who'll take care of your precious wife and nephew, then? The same neighbors who are standing here now, Abigail said, riding forward. Mr. Crawford, you've made a fundamental error. You think we're all separate, easy to pick off one by one. But we're not. We're a community. Apache and white rancher and farmer, we stand together. Pretty words, but words won't stop federal marshals. No, said a new voice, but I might. Everyone turned to see a man in an expensive suit riding up with several companions. He had the look of authority about him. Real authority, not the purchased kind the local judge wore like an ill-fitting coat. Senator Mackenzie, Crawford said, his voice suddenly uncertain. What are you doing here? I received some interesting telegrams about railroad company overreach in this valley. Thought I'd come see for myself. The senator dismounted, looking around at the assembled crowd. Quite a gathering, Indians and settlers working together. That's something you don't see often. They're interfering with legal proceedings. Are they Judge Morrison, isn't it? I wasn't aware you had jurisdiction in federal treaty lands. The judge paled. I was told the treaties were invalid. By whom, Mr. Crawford? Here, did you verify that information independently, or did you just take the word of the man paying your expenses? The judge's silence was answer enough. Senator Mackenzie turned to address the crowd. The federal investigation into railroad company practices in this region has revealed systematic corruption, bribery, and attempted land theft. As of this morning, the Mountain Pacific Railroad Company's charter in this territory has been suspended pending full review. Crawford's face went from red to white. You can't do that. The railroad has investments contracts. The railroad should have thought of that before trying to steal land from both Indians and settlers. Mr. Crawford, I suggest you and your men leave immediately. Any further attempts to harass these people will result in federal charges. As Crawford and his men retreated in disgrace, the senator approached Lucas and Abigail. You're the Boones, I've heard a lot about you. Your petition, along with the evidence you provided, was instrumental in getting Washington's attention. We just wanted to keep our home, Lucas said simply. And in doing so, you've helped others keep theirs. The senator looked around at the mixed gathering Apache and white standing together. This is what the future should look like. Different peoples finding common ground, protecting each other. It gives me hope. After the senator left, promising continued federal oversight, the Apache settlement erupted in celebration. Chino embraced Henry, then Lucas, and finally, to her surprise, Abigail. You have the heart of a warrior, he told her. My daughter would have been proud to call you sister. That evening, they held a feast in the Apache camp. It was awkward at first, two cultures trying to find common ground, but food and relief broke down barriers. Abigail found herself teaching Apache women how to make Pennsylvania Dutch apple butter while learning their recipe for fry bread. Henry translated moving between worlds with new confidence. Lucas watched it all with wonder. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be celebrating with Apache warriors and calling them family, I'd have said they were mad. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be married to a Colorado rancher and standing up to railroad barons, I'd have said the same, Abigail replied. No regrets. She looked at him, this man who'd become everything to her. None. You, only one. At her questioning look, he continued, I regret that our wedding was so hasty, so practical. You deserved better. I deserved exactly what I got, a man who saw my worth when everyone else saw only shame. Still, Lucas said, then raised his voice. Chino, the Apache perform marriages, don't they? The old man's eyes sparkled with understanding. We do. And Reverend Michaels, Lucas called to the minister who'd arrived with the second wave of supporters, you're authorized to perform marriages. I am, but you're already. The Reverend stopped, understanding dawning. Oh, yes, I see. Abigail Yoder Boone, Lucas said, dropping to one knee in front of everyone. Would you marry me again? Properly this time with our family and community as witnesses, not because we need to, but because we want to. Abigail felt tears streaming down her face. Around them, the crowd had gone silent, Apache and white alike, watching with held breath. Yes, she said, pulling him to his feet. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. They were married again that night under the stars with Reverend Michaels speaking the Christian words and Chino adding Apache blessings. Henry stood as Lucas's best man, beaming with pride. Tom Garrett's wife, who'd arrived with the other ranch women, stood with Abigail. It was, everyone agreed later, the strangest and most beautiful wedding the valley had ever seen. 2 cultures, 2 ceremonies, one love that had grown from necessity into something precious and unbreakable. When they returned to the ranch the next day, they found a telegram waiting. Crawford had been arrested in Denver for fraud and conspiracy. The Mountain Pacific Railroad was pulling out of the valley entirely. Their attention turned to less troublesome routes. "It's over," Lucas said, reading the telegram. "It's really over." "No," Abigail corrected, taking his hand. "It's just beginning." Winter settled over the valley in earnest, but the Boone Ranch was warm with more than just fire. Neighbors dropped by regularly, no longer out of crisis, but out of friendship. The Apache came to trade their children playing with ranch children, while adults shared food and stories. Henry thrived in this new world, proud of both sides of his heritage. He spent mornings doing lessons with Abigail, afternoons learning ranch work from Lucas, and weekends learning Apache traditions from Chino. The boy who'd once been caught between 2 worlds now stood confidently in both. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, the 3 of them sat by the fire. Abigail was knitting, Lucas was oiling his rifle, and Henry was reading aloud from a book of Shakespeare that Abigail had found in town. "All the world's a stage," Henry read, "and all the men and women merely players." "What do you think that means?" Abigail asked. Henry thought about it. "Maybe that we all have parts to play. Like how you played the part of a wife before it became real. Or how I played the part of a father before I understood what it truly meant," Lucas added, ruffling Henry's hair. "Or how I played the part of a white boy and an Apache boy before I realized I could be both," Henry finished. They sat in comfortable silence, each contemplating the strange paths that had brought them together. Outside the wind howled, but inside they were safe, warm, and complete. "I've been thinking," Lucas said suddenly. "This house has 4 bedrooms. Seems a waste just the 3 of us here." Abigail's hands stilled on her knitting. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Henry could use brothers or sisters. If you wanted." She looked at him, this man who'd given her everything when she'd had nothing, who'd helped her find strength she didn't know she possessed. "I want that. Very much." Henry made a face. "Just so you know, I'm too old to help with diapers." They laughed, and the sound filled the house like a blessing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in white, covering the scars of their battles, preparing the ground for spring and new growth. Spring came slowly to the valley that year, the snow reluctant to release its grip on the mountains. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it changes that would transform the Boone Ranch forever. Abigail noticed the first signs in herself, the morning sickness that sent her rushing from the breakfast table, the tenderness in her body, the bone-deep exhaustion that came from nowhere. She kept it secret for 2 weeks, wanting to be certain before she spoke. It was Henry who guessed first, finding her retching behind the barn one morning when she thought everyone was out working the far pasture. "Aunt Abigail, are you sick?" His green eyes were wide with concern. She wiped her mouth with her handkerchief, trying to compose herself. "Not sick, Henry, not exactly." Understanding dawned on his face, followed quickly by joy. "You're going to have a baby." "I think so, but don't tell your uncle yet. I want to be sure." Henry's attempt at keeping the secret lasted exactly 3 hours. Lucas cornered Abigail in the kitchen that evening, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Henry says he thinks—" He started again. "Abigail, are you with child?" She set down the plate she'd been washing, turned to face him. "I believe I am." The transformation in his face was something she would remember forever. Joy, wonder, and a flash of fear all mingled together. He crossed to her in 2 strides, then stopped abruptly as if afraid to touch her. Are you happy about it?" "Lucas Boone, I've never been happier about anything in my life." She took his hands, placed them on her still flat stomach. "We're having a baby. A child born not from arrangement or necessity, but from love." He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was made of spun glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "I thought I'd never, after Thomas." "This child won't replace Thomas," Abigail said gently. "No one could, but this is a new beginning, a new chance. What if something happens? What if I'm not good enough? What if—" She silenced him with a kiss. "What if everything is wonderful? What if this child grows up surrounded by love, with parents who fought for their home and each other, with a brother like Henry to protect them, with a community of Apache and settlers alike to teach them? What if Lucas Boone were about to be happier than we ever imagined possible?" The news spread through the valley like wildfire on a dry prairie. Tom Garrett's wife Susan arrived the next day with a basket of baby clothes saved from her own children. "Figured you might need these," she said, her manner gruff, but her eyes kind. "First baby's always the hardest. You need anything you ask." More neighbors followed, bringing gifts and advice. Even some of the townspeople who'd been at that awful auction came by shamefaced but sincere in their congratulations. It seemed the story of the Boones had become something of a legend in San Miguel County, the grieving rancher who'd saved an outcast woman, the woman who'd helped save a valley, the love that had grown from the rockiest of soil. Chino arrived a week later with a beautifully woven cradle board decorated with symbols of protection and strength. "For the new warrior, he said, placing it reverently in Abigail's hands. "My daughter would have wanted her brother's child to have this." "Thank you," Abigail said, touched beyond words. "It's beautiful." "The child will need strength," Chino said, his dark eyes serious. "I have heard troubling news from Denver. Crawford has made bail. He blames you for his downfall." Lucas's hand went to his gun. "If he comes here, he is too clever for direct confrontation now, but a wounded snake is most dangerous. Be watchful." They were watchful. But as weeks turned to months and Abigail's pregnancy progressed, the threat of Crawford seemed to fade. There was too much work to do, too much life happening to dwell on past enemies. The ranch prospered as never before. The cattle were healthy, the garden Abigail had replanted was flourishing, and Henry was growing like a weed already nearly as tall as Abigail. It was a warm June evening when everything changed. Abigail was in the garden, her movements slower now, with her expanding belly, when she heard horses approaching. Many horses. She straightened one hand going to her back, the other shading her eyes against the setting sun. The riders came into view, a dozen men all armed with Crawford at their head. But these weren't hired guns from Denver. These were harder men with the look of those who killed for pleasure rather than pay. "Lucas," she called, but he was in the far pasture with Henry too far to hear. She moved as quickly as she could toward the house, toward the shotgun she knew was just inside the door. Crawford and his men had surrounded the house by the time she reached the porch. He dismounted slowly, savoring the moment. "Mrs. Boone, you're looking maternal." His smile was cold, vicious. "Where's your husband?" "He'll be back any moment." "No, he won't. I've been watching. He and the boy won't be back for at least an hour. Plenty of time for what I have planned." Fear crawled up Abigail's spine, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you want, Crawford?" "Justice. You cost me everything, my position, my fortune, my reputation. It seems only fair that I return the favor." "By threatening a pregnant woman." "How brave of you." His face flushed. "You think you're so clever, don't you? The fat Amish woman who brought down the railroad. Well, let's see how clever you are when your house is ashes and your husband comes home to find nothing but ruins." He nodded to his men, who began pulling torches from their saddles. Kerosene, Abigail realized. They'd brought kerosene to make sure the fire would take. "You burn this house, you'll hang for it," she said, fighting to keep the desperation from her voice. "Only if they can prove it was me. House fires happen all the time out here. Tragic accident. Poor pregnant widow losing everything." He stepped closer. "Unless, of course, you want to negotiate." "What kind of negotiation?" "Sign over the ranch to me. I have the papers right here. Sign them and you all leave tonight unharmed. Refuse?" He shrugged. "Well, accidents happen." Abigail's mind raced. Sign and they'd lose everything they'd fought for. Refuse and she might not survive to see Lucas again. The baby moved within her, a reminder of what was at stake.
I need to read the papers, she said, stalling for time. Crawford handed them over, watching her with snake eyes.
She pretended to read, but her attention was on the horizon, searching for any sign of Lucas and Henry. Nothing. Then she heard a sound that might have been wind, but she knew better. It was a bird call, but not from any bird native to Colorado. An Apache signal. "These terms are," she began, then dropped the papers as if startled. As Crawford bent to retrieve them, she saw them Chino and 3 Apache warriors positioned on the ridge behind the house. How long had they been there? How had they known "clumsy cow"? Crawford muttered, straightening with the papers. "Now sign them." "No. No!" His voice rose dangerously. "You'd rather burn—" "I'd rather fight." She raised her voice. "Wouldn't you agree, grandfather—" Crawford spun around just as Chino stood up on the ridge, his rifle trained on Crawford's chest. The other warriors rose as well, weapons ready. "Let the woman go," Chino said calmly. "This fight is not with her." Crawford's men reached for their guns but froze as more Apache appeared, dozens of them, rising from concealment like ghosts. The entire Apache band had come. "You called in savages to fight your battles," Crawford snarled at Abigail. "I called no one. Family doesn't need to be called, they just know when they're needed." It might have ended there, a standoff resolved without bloodshed, but one of Crawford's men panicked. He drew his gun, firing wildly at the Apache on the ridge. The shot went wide, but it shattered the tension like glass. The Apache returned fire, their shots precise and deadly. Crawford's men scattered, some shooting back, others running for their horses. Crawford himself grabbed Abigail, using her as a shield, as he backed toward the house. "Call them off," he screamed. "Call them off, or I'll—" The gunshot was impossibly loud. Crawford's grip loosened, and he looked down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his shirt. Behind him, Lucas stood with his rifle still smoking, Henry beside him. "Let go of my wife," Lucas said quietly. Crawford fell to his knees, then forward, his blood soaking into the dirt of the garden Abigail had so carefully tended. His men, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Lucas was at Abigail's side in an instant, his hands running over her, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt, the baby?" "We're fine," she assured him, though she was shaking. "How did you know?" "Chino's grandson found us, told us riders were heading for the house. We rode hard." He pulled her against him. "If anything had happened to you—" "But it didn't. We're safe, all of us." The aftermath was swift. The sheriff, who'd conveniently been absent during Crawford's previous schemes, arrived to arrest the surviving gang members. Crawford himself was buried in an unmarked grave outside town, unmourned and unremembered, except as a cautionary tale about the price of greed and vengeance. But for Abigail, the real aftermath came that night when the adrenaline faded and the reality of what had almost happened hit her. She found herself sobbing in Lucas's arms, her whole body shaking with delayed terror. "I could have lost everything," she wept. "You Henry the baby." "But you didn't," Lucas soothed, holding her tightly. "You were brave, you were smart, and you survived. We all did." "I wasn't brave. I was terrified." "That's what Henry said courage was, remember. Being afraid but doing what needs to be done anyway. You faced down a dozen armed men while carrying our child. If that's not courage, I don't know what is." The baby came early, perhaps stirred to action by the excitement of that terrible day. Abigail's labor started just after midnight on a humid July night, with lightning flickering on the horizon and the air heavy with pending storm. Lucas, who'd faced down gunmen and blizzards with steady nerves, was a wreck. He paced the hallway outside their bedroom while Susan Garrett and the midwife tended to Abigail, his face pale with worry. "She's strong," Henry kept saying, as much to reassure himself as his uncle. "Aunt Abigail is the strongest person we know." But strength could only carry someone so far, and as the hours dragged on and Abigail's cries grew weaker, fear settled over the house like a shroud. The midwife emerged, her face grave. "The baby's turned wrong," she said. "I can't shift it, if we can't get it to turn." She didn't need to finish. They all knew what happened when babies couldn't be born properly. Lucas's face went gray and he swayed on his feet. "There must be something." "There is," came a voice from the doorway. Chino's wife, whom Abigail had met only once before, stood there with a bag of herbs and an air of calm authority. Apache women have been birthing babies in difficult positions for generations. Let me help. The midwife started to protest, but Lucas cut her off. Let her try, please. What followed was a blend of Apache wisdom and frontier medicine that no medical text would ever record. Chino's wife used pressure points and positions that the midwife had never seen, herbs that eased pain while keeping Abigail alert, and most importantly, a calm strength that filled the room like a blessing. You are stronger than you know, she told Abigail in accented English. This child comes from fighters, from survivors. Show your baby how to fight. And Abigail did. With Lucas finally allowed in the room, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, she found reserves of strength she didn't know existed. As the storm finally broke outside, sending rain pounding against the windows, their child entered the world with a cry that could be heard over the thunder. A girl, the midwife announced, her voice thick with emotion. A perfect, healthy girl. Lucas was crying openly as he took his daughter in his arms, this tiny miracle with her mother's nose and what might in time prove to be his eyes. She's beautiful, he whispered. Abigail, she's perfect. What will you name her? Susan Garrett asked, smiling through her own tears. Abigail and Lucas looked at each other, a complete conversation, in a single glance. Mary, Abigail said. Mary Faith Boone. For the past we honor and the future we believe in. Henry was allowed in then, approaching his new cousin with the reverence usually reserved for church. She's so small, he breathed. Was I ever that small? Smaller, Lucas told him, and just as perfect. Can I hold her? Sit down first, Abigail instructed, and when Henry was settled in the chair beside the bed, Lucas carefully placed Mary in his arms. Hello, little cousin, Henry whispered. I'm going to teach you everything: how to ride, how to track, how to stand up to bullies. And Aunt Abigail will teach you to be strong and kind, and Uncle Luke will teach you to be brave and true. You're going to have the best family in the whole world. Watching them, her husband, her nephew's son, her new daughter Abigail, felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. A year ago, she'd stood on courthouse steps being auctioned like property. Now she was surrounded by family, by love, by a life built on choice rather than circumstance. The news of Mary's birth spread through the valley, and for weeks visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes. The Apache brought beaded moccasins and blankets. The ranchers' wives brought preserves and advice. Even people from town came, those who'd witnessed the auction and wanted to see for themselves the happiness that had grown from such an ugly beginning. One visitor stood out from the rest. It was a late August afternoon when a familiar wagon approached the house. Abigail, sitting on the porch with Mary sleeping in her arms, recognized it immediately. Elder Stoltzfus had returned, but this time he was alone. Lucas emerged from the barn, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun, but Abigail shook her head slightly. Let's hear what he has to say. The elder climbed down from his wagon, and Abigail was shocked to see how much he'd aged in just a few months. His beard was whiter, his movement slower, his proud bearing diminished. Mrs. Boone, he said, removing his hat, I've come to speak with you. Then speak, Lucas said coldly. The elder's eyes fixed on the baby in Abigail's arms, and something in his expression cracked. Your sister Martha, she wanted you to know she's with child herself now. The marriage went forward despite everything. I'm happy for her, Abigail said, and found she meant it. She also wanted me to tell you that she was wrong. We were all wrong. The words seemed to physically pain him. What we did to you, casting you out when you'd done nothing but try to survive your father's mistakes. It wasn't God's way. It was pride, harsh judgment disguised as righteousness. Abigail sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. I've come to ask your forgiveness, the elder continued, the words dragged from him like confession under torture. Not for your sake, but for my own soul. I've been unable to pray since that day we came here, unable to find peace. I see now that we were the ones who strayed from God's path, not you. And what do you want from me? Abigail asked quietly. Only your forgiveness, if you can grant it. I don't expect you to return. I can see you found your place, your true family. You're happy here in ways you never were among us." Abigail looked at Lucas, who nodded slightly. This was her choice. She looked at Henry, watching protectively from the doorway. Finally, she looked down at Mary, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger hurts me more than it hurts you. And because I want my daughter to grow up in a world with more forgiveness than judgment." The elder's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you. There's one more thing. Your father's farm. The community sold it to pay his debts, but there was money left over. It's rightfully yours." He pulled out a bank draft. "It's not much, but perhaps it will help with your new family." Abigail took the draft. Saw it was for nearly $3,000 a fortune by frontier standards. "This is generous. It's just something we should have been from the beginning." The elder climbed back onto his wagon, then paused. "Your mother would be proud of what you've become, Abigail. You've found your own way to serve God through love, rather than rules, through inclusion, rather than exclusion. Perhaps that was his plan all along." After he left, Lucas sat beside her on the porch, his arm around her shoulders. "That was unexpected." "Everything about this year has been unexpected," Abigail replied. "But I wouldn't change any of it. Not even the hard parts, the mockery, the threats, the fear, especially not those. They're what made us strong enough for the good parts." As summer turned to autumn, the ranch thrived as never before. The cattle were fat and healthy, the harvest was bountiful, and the house rang with Mary's laughter and Henry's increasingly cracking voice as he entered adolescence. Lucas had built an addition to the house, a proper nursery for Mary, and a larger room for Henry, who was rapidly outgrowing his childhood space. It was during the harvest celebration, with the house full of neighbors and friends, that Abigail stood back and surveyed what her life had become. In the parlor, Apache warriors discussed cattle prices with white ranchers. In the kitchen, women of various backgrounds shared recipes and gossip. In the yard, children played together, their different skin colors mattering less than their shared games. "You did this," Lucas said, coming up behind her, Mary sleeping against his shoulder. "This community, this unity, it started with you standing up to prejudice and fear." "It started with you," she corrected. "The moment you said, 'I'll take the Amish girl,' and gave me dignity when the world wanted to strip it away. We did it together then. All of us, you, me, Henry, Chino, our neighbors. We proved that different kinds of people can be family if they choose to be." Henry joined them, now taller than Abigail and still growing. "Grandfather Chino wants to know if I can spend next week at the winter camp. He says it's time I learned the ceremony for becoming a man in the Apache tradition." "And you want to go?" Lucas asked. "I do, but I also want to stay here, help with the ranch. I feel torn between two worlds sometimes." "You're not between two worlds," Abigail told him firmly. "You're the bridge that connects them. That's your strength, not your weakness." That night, after the guests had gone home and Mary was asleep in her crib, Lucas and Abigail stood on their porch, looking out at their land, their kingdom built from determination and love. "Do you ever think about how unlikely this all is?" Lucas asked. "A grieving rancher, a shunned Amish woman, and a half-Apache boy becoming a family." "Every day?" Abigail admitted. "And every day I thank God for that auction, as horrible as it was, because it brought me to you, to this life, to our daughter and son." "Henry's going to be a remarkable man," Lucas said. "He already is, really. The way he moves between cultures, the way he stands up for what's right, that's your influence. And yours. He learned courage from watching you face down men like Crawford and Braddock. He learned integrity from seeing you treat everyone with respect regardless of their background. We make a good team, Mrs. Boone." "The best, Mr. Boone." As autumn deepened into winter, Abigail discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was no fear in Lucas's eyes, only joy. They'd weathered so much together that another child seemed less like a risk and more like a blessing. The winter was mild that year, and by spring, when Abigail was heavy with child again, the valley had become a model for what the New West could be: diverse, cooperative, strong. Federal officials came to study how Apache and settlers had learned to live in harmony. Journalists wrote articles about the auction that had become a love story, the conflict that had become cooperation.
But for Abigail, the greatest triumph was smaller and quieter than any newspaper could capture. It was Henry reading to Mary in Apache and English, switching seamlessly between languages. It was Lucas's work-roughened hand on her swollen belly, feeling their second child move. It was the garden she'd replanted now blooming with vegetables and flowers, fed by soil that had seemed too hard for anything to grow. Their son was born as spring turned to summer, entering the world with far less drama than his sister had. They named him Thomas Joseph, honoring Lucas's first son while looking toward the future. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's sturdy build, and Henry declared him much less fragile-looking than Mary was.
It was during Thomas's baptism, performed jointly by Reverend Michaels and Chino, in a ceremony that would have scandalized both their communities just 2 years earlier, that Abigail realized the full measure of their triumph. They hadn't just survived the attacks on their ranch, their dignity, their family. They'd transformed an entire community's understanding of what family could mean. "Look at them," Susan Garrett said, standing beside Abigail as she watched Lucas holding Thomas while Henry played with Mary in the churchyard Apache and white children running together around them. A year and a half ago, most of these people would have crossed the street to avoid each other. Now look. "People can change," Abigail said. "When they see that their fears are unfounded, when they realize that different doesn't mean dangerous, they can change. You changed them. You and Lucas by being brave enough to stand together when the whole world said you shouldn't." That evening, as their expanded family gathered for Sunday dinner, Chino and his wife had become regular fixtures at their table. Henry raised his glass of milk in what had become a family tradition. "To the Boone family," he said, his voice now fully changed, deep and sure. "Proof that God has a sense of humor and a plan we can't always see." "To family," Lucas corrected, as he always did, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "To love," Abigail added, looking around the table at these people who'd become her world, the kind that grows in unlikely soil and blooms despite every storm. "To second chances." Chino contributed, his weathered face creased in a rare smile, "and the wisdom to take them when they're offered." As they ate and talked and laughed, Mary toddling between them and Thomas sleeping peacefully in his basket, Abigail thought about the woman she'd been on those courthouse steps, broken-mocked without hope. That woman could never have imagined this moment, this fullness, this joy. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps sometimes you had to be broken completely before you could be rebuilt into something stronger. Perhaps sometimes the worst day of your life was actually the first day of your real life, the one you were always meant to live. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried wild and free, and in a ranch house in Colorado, a family that shouldn't exist by any reasonable measure continued to prove that love was the most unreasonable and powerful force in the universe.